We're going to be reading chapter 23. It's called Monster. It's about a particular POW prison guard, camp guard. And as you can see, I've got a new light. This channel is growing, so help it grow. And it's going to continue getting better. And help support it by clicking the thumbs up and sending this video somewhere, posting it on your Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Okay, so chapter 23, Monster. It was late morning on that last day of September 1944. Louis, Frank, Tinker, and a handful of other Ofuna veterans stood by the front gate of the Omori POW camp, which sat on an artificial island in Tokyo Bay. The island was nothing more than a sandy spit, connected to shore by a tenacious thread of bamboo slats. Across the water was the bright bustle of Tokyo, still virtually untouched by the war. Other than the patches of early snow scattered over the ground like hopscotch squares, every inch of the camp was an ashen, otherworldly gray, reminding one POW of the moon. There were no birds anywhere. They were standing before a small office, where they'd been told to wait. In front of them, standing beside the building, was a Japanese corporal. He was leering at them. He was a beautifully crafted man, a few years short of 30. His face was handsome, with full lips that turned up slightly at the edges, giving his mouth a faintly cruel expression. Beneath his smartly tailored uniform, his body was perfectly balanced, his torso radiating power, his form trim. A sword angled elegantly off his hip encircled his waist, but was a broad, webbed belt embellished with an enormous metal buckle. The only incongruities of this striking corporal was his hands, huge, brutish, animal things that man would liken to paws. There's a really great picture of the monster in here, too. The picture of the guy, he looks exactly like this guard. When I was 17, I was sent to this boot camp jail thing, and one of the guards there was notorious for being mean and cruel and sadistic, and he looks exactly like the picture of this guy who's mean and cruel and sadistic. Louis and the other prisoners stood at attention, arms stiff, hands flat to their sides. The corporal continued to stare, but said nothing. Near him stood another man who wore a second lieutenant's insignia, yet hovered about the lower-ranking corporal with eager civility. 5, perhaps 10 minutes passed, and the corporal never moved. Then, abruptly, he swept toward the prisoners, the second lieutenant scurrying behind. He walked with his chin high and his chest puffed, his gestures exaggerated and imperious. He began to inspect the men with an air of possession, looking them over. Louis thought as if he were God himself. Down the line the corporal strode, pausing before each man, ranking his eyes over him and barking, "Name!" When he reached Louis, he stopped. Louis gave him his name. The corporal's eyes narrowed. Decades after the war, men who had looked into those eyes would be unable to shake the memory of what they saw in them. A wrongness that elicited a twist in the gut, a prickle up the back of the neck. Louis dropped his eyes. Then there was a rush in the air, the corporal's arm swinging, then a fist thudding into Louis's head. Louis staggered. "Why you no look me in the eye?" the corporal shouted. The other men in the line went rigid. Louis steadied himself. His face held he held his face taut as he raised his eyes to the corporal's face. Again came the whirling arm, the jarring blow to his skull. His stumbling legs tried to hold him upright. "You don't look at me." This man, thought Tinker, is a psychopath. This whole chapter just describes how crazy this guard was. The corporal marched the men to a quarantine area where they stood at under a rickety canopy. He ordered the men to stand beneath it, then left. Hours passed. The men stood, the cold working its way up their sleeves and pant legs. Eventually they sat down. The morning gave way to a long, cold afternoon. The corporal didn't come back. Louis saw a wooden apple box lying nearby. Remembering his Boy Scout friction fire training, he grabbed the box and broke it up. He asked one of the other men to unearth the lace from his boot. He fashioned a spindle out of a bamboo stick, fitted into the hole in a slat from the apple box, and wound the bootlace around the spindle, and began alternately pulling the ends, turning the spindle. After a good bit of work, smoke rose from the spindle. Louis picked up the bits of discarded tatami mat, laid them on the smoking area, and blew on them. The mat remnants whooshed into flames. The men gathered close to the fire, and cigarettes emerged from their pockets. Everyone got warmer. The corporal suddenly reappeared. "Nanda, Nanda," he said, a word that roughly translates to, "What the hell is going on?" He demanded to know where they'd gotten the matches. Louis explained how he had built the fire. The corporal's face clouded over. Without warning, the corporal slugged Louis in the head, then swung his arm back for another blow. Louis wanted to duck, but he fought the instinct, knowing that from Ofuna this would only provoke more blows. So he stood still, holding his expression neutral. As the second swing connected with his head, the corporal ordered them to put the fire out, then walked away. Louis had met the man who would dedicate himself to shattering him. The corporal's name was Muchiro Watanabe. He was born during World War I, the fourth of 6 children of the Shizuki Watanabe, a lovely and exceptionally wealthy woman. The Watanabes enjoyed a privileged life, having amassed riches through ownership of Tokyo's Taksamudi Hotel and other real estate and mines in Nagano and Manchuria. Matsutiro, whose father, a pilot, seems to have died or left the family when Matsuhiro was relatively young. He grew up in a luxury life, living in beautiful homes all over Japan, reportedly waited on by servants and swimming in his family's private pool. His siblings knew him affectionately as Mu-chan. After a childhood in Kobe, Mutsuchiro attended Tokyo's prestigious Waseda University, where he studied French literature and cultivated an infatuation with nihilism. In 1942, he graduated, settled in Tokyo, and took up a job at a news agency. He worked there for only 1 month. Japan was at war, and Mutsuhiro was deeply patriotic. He enlisted in the army. Watanabe had lofty expectations for himself as a soldier. One of his older brothers was an officer, and his other older sister's husband was commander at Chengji, a giant POW camp in Singapore. Attaining an officer's rank was of supreme importance to Watanabe, and when he applied to become an officer, he probably thought that acceptance was his due, given his education and pedigree. But he was rejected. He would be only a corporal. By all accounts, this was the moment that derailed him, leaving him feeling disgraced, infuriated, and bitterly jealous of officers. Those who knew him would say that every part of his mind gathered around the blazing humiliation, and every subsequent action was informed by it. This defining event would have tragic consequences for hundreds of men. Corporal Watanabe was sent to a regiment of the Imperial Guards in Tokyo, stationed near Hiroshido's palace. As the war hadn't yet come to Japan's home islands, he saw no combat. In the fall of 1943, for unknown reasons, Watanabe was transferred to the military's most ignominious station for NCOs, a POW camp. Perhaps his superiors wanted to rid the Imperial Guards of an unstable and venomous soldier, or perhaps they wanted to put his validity to use. Watanabe was assigned to Omori and designated the disciplinary officer. On the last day of 1943, Watanabe arrived. Even prior to Watanabe's appearance, Omori had been a trying place. The 1929 Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but not ratified, permitted detaining powers to use POWs for labor with restrictions. The laborers had to be physically fit, and the labor couldn't be dangerous, unhealthy, or unreasonably difficult. The work had to be unconnected to the operations of war, and POWs were to be given pay compensate for their labor. Finally, to ensure that POW officers had control over their men, the POW officers could not be forced to work. Virtually nothing about Japan's use of POWs was in keeping with the Geneva Convention. To be an enlisted prisoner of war under the Japanese was to be a slave. The Japanese government made contracts with private companies to enlist POWs to send enlisted POWs to factories, mines, docks, and railways where the men were forced into exceptionally arduous war production or war transport labor. The labor performed under club-wielding foremen was so dangerous and exhausting that thousands of POWs died on the job. In the extremely rare instances in which the Japanese compensated the POWs for their work, payment amounted to almost nothing, equivalent to a few pennies a week. The only aspect of the Geneva Convention that the Japanese sometimes respected was the prohibition on forcing officers to work. Like almost every other camp, Omori was a slave camp. For 10 to 11 hours a day, 7 days a week, Omori's enlisted POWs did backbreaking labor at shipyards, rail yards, truck loading stations, a sandpit, and a coal yard. Men had to be on the verge of death to be spared. Minimum fever levels for the exemption were 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The labor was extremely grueling. According to POW Tom Wade, each man at the Tokyo rail yards lifted a total of 20 to 30 tons of material a day. Probably because Omori was used as a show camp where prisoners were displayed for Red Cross, the men were paid 10 yen per month, less than the price of a pack of cigarettes, but they were permitted to spend it only on tiny selection of worthless goods at a camp canteen, so the money came right back to the Japanese. Compounding the hardship of Omori was the food situation. The rations were of better quality than those of Ofuna, but were doled out in only slightly larger quantities. Because officers weren't enslaved, they were allowed only half the ration given to slaves. on the justification that they needed fewer calories. Along with rice, the men received some vegetables, but protein was almost non-existent. About once a week, someone would push a wheelbarrow into the camp bearing meat. Because a wheelbarrow's worth was spread over 100 men, a serving amounted to about a thimble-sized portion. It consisted of things like lungs, intestines, assorted dog parts, something for POWs called elephant semen, and once a mystery lump that, after considerable speculation, the men decided was a horse's vagina. Just as in Ofuna, Barabia and other preventable diseases were epidemic at Omori. Because rations were halved for sick men who were unable to work, the ill couldn't recover. Men harrowed by dysentery, the Benjo Boogie, swallow lumps of coal or burnt sticks to slow the digestive waterfall. Many men weighed less than 90 pounds. The only saving grace of Omori prior to November 1943 had been the attitude of the Japanese personnel, who weren't nearly as vicious as those of Ofuna. The prisoners gave them nicknames, including Hogjaw, Baby Dumpling, Bucktooth, Genghis Khan, Roving Reporter. One unfortunate officer, wrote POW Lewis Bush, wore puffy pants and walked as though he was always bursting to go to the lavatory, prompting the men to call him Lieutenant Shittenbritches. They were a few rogues and one or two outright loons, but several camp employees were friendly. The rest were indifferent, enforcing the rules with blows, but at least behaving predictably. Relatively speaking, Omori wasn't known for violence. When Watanabe came, all that changed. That was the crazy guard that this chapter is about, Watanabe. Mitsuhui Watanabe. He arrived bearing candy and cigarettes for the POWs. He's crazy. He smiled and made pleasant conversation, posed for photographs with British officers, and spoke admirably of America and Britain. For several days he raised not a ripple. On a Sunday morning, Watanabe approached some POWs crowded in a barracks doorway. A POW named Derek Clark piped up, "Gangway!" to clear a path. That one word sent Watanabe into an explosion. So the other POW saw the officer come, the Japanese guard coming, and said, "Gangway, out of the way, officer coming," And then the guard's like, "What are you doing?" And went crazy. He lunged at Clark, beat him until he fell down, then kicked him. As Bush tried to explain that Clark had meant no harm, Watanabe drew his sword and began screaming that he was going to behead Clark. The Japanese officer stopped the attack, but that evening Watanabe turned on Bush, hurling him into a scalding stove, then pummeling and kicking him. After Bush went to bed, Watanabe returned and forced him to his knees. For 3 hours, Watanabe besieged Bush, kicking him and hacking off his hair with a sword. He left for 2 hours, then returned again. Bush expected to be murdered. Instead, Watanabe took him to his office, hugged him, and gave him beer and handfuls of candy and cigarettes. Through tears, he apologized and promised never to mistreat another POW. His resolution didn't last. Later that night, he picked up a kendo stick, a long and heavy training sword, and ran shrieking into the barracks, clubbing every man he saw. Watanabe had, in Bush's words, shown his hand. From that day on, both his victim and his fellow Japanese would ponder his violent, erratic behavior and disagree on its cause. To Yuichi Hatuo, the camp accountant, it was simply madness. Others saw something calculating. After Watanabe attacked Clark, POW officers who had barely noticed him began looking at him with terror. The consequence of his outburst answering a ravening desire. Raw brutality gave him sway over men that his rank did not. Even people ranked above him were scared of him. He suddenly saw that he hit a few men, and he was feared and respected for that, said Wei, and so that became his style of behavior, his M.O. It doesn't say M.O., I added that. Watanabe derived another pleasure from violence. According to Hado, Watanabe was a sexual sadist, freely admitting that beating prisoners brought him to climax. He did enjoy hurting POWs, wrote Hado. He was satisfying his sexual desire by hurting them. A tyrant was born. Watanabe beat POWs every day, fracturing their windpipes, rupturing their eardrums, shattering their teeth, tearing one man's ear half off, leaving men unconscious. He made one officer sit in a shack wearing only fundushi undergarment for 4 days in the winter. He tied a 65-year-old POW to a tree and left him there for 3 days. He ordered one man to report to be punched in the face every night for 3 weeks. He practiced judo on an appendectomy patient. When gripped in the ecstasy of an assault, he wailed and howled, drooled and frothed, sometimes sobbing, tears running down his cheeks. Men came to know when an outburst was imminent. Watanabe's right eyelid would sag a moment before he snapped. Very quickly, Watanabe gained a fearsome reputation throughout Japan. Officials at other camps began sending troublesome prisoners to Watanabe for polishing, and Omori was dubbed a punishment camp. In the words of Commander Marin, who was transferred from Ofuna to become the ranking Omori POW, Watanabe was the most vicious guard in any prison camp on the main island of Japan. Two things separated Watanabe from other notorious war criminals. One was the emphasis that he placed on emotional torture. Even by the standards of his honor-conscious culture, he was unusually consumed by his perceived humiliation and was intent upon inflicting the same pain on the men under his power. Where men like the quack were simply goons, Watanabe combined beatings with acts meant to batter men's psyches. He forced men to bow at pumpkins or trees for hours. He ordered a clergyman POW to stand all night saluting a flagpole, shouting the Japanese word for salute, Kioria! Kioria! The experience left the man weeping and out of his mind. He confiscated and destroyed POW's family photographs and brought men to his office to show them letters from home, then burned the unopened letters in front of them. To ensure that men felt utterly helpless, he changed the manner in which he demanded to be addressed each day, beating anyone who guessed wrong. He ordered men to violate camp policies, then attack them for breaking the rules. POW Jack Brady summed him up in one sentence. He was absolutely the most sadistic man I ever met. I don't know if he had a Texan accent, I'm just guessing. The other attribute that separated Watanabe from fellow guards was his inconsistency. Most of the time he was the wrathful god of Omori, but after beatings he sometimes returned to apologize, often in tears. These fits of contrition usually lasted only moments before the shrieking and punching began again. He would spin from serenity to raving madness in the blink of an eye, usually for no reason. One POW recalled seeing him gently praise a POW, fly into a rage and beat the POW unconscious, then amble to his office and eat his lunch with the placidity of a grazing cow. Grazing cow. Grazing cow. When Watanabe wasn't thrashing POWs, he was forcing them to be his buddies. He'd wake a POW in the night and be as nice as pie, asking the man to join him in his room, where he'd serve cookies and talk about literatures. Sometimes he'd round up anyone in the camp who could play an instrument or sing, bring them to his room, and host a concert. He expected the men to respond as if they adored him, and at times he seemed to honestly believe that they did. Maybe he held these gatherings because they left the POWs feeling more stressed than if he were consistently hostile, or maybe he was just lonely. Among the Japanese at Omori, Watanabe was despised for his haughtiness, his boast about his wealth, and his curtness. He made a great show of his education, droning on about nihilism and giving pompous lectures on French literature at NCO meetings. None of his colleagues listened. It wasn't the subject matter, it was simply that they loathed him. So the other guards disliked this guy as much as the prisoners. Perhaps this is why he turned to POWs for friendship. The tea parties, wrote Derek Clark, were tense, sitting on the edge of volcano affairs. Any misstep, any misunderstood word might set Watanabe off, leaving him smashing teapots, upending tables, and pounding his guests into oblivion. That's a tea party. That's my kind of tea party. After the POWs left, Watanabe seemed to feel humiliated by having had to force friendship from lowly POWs. The next day, he would often deliver a wild-eyed whipping to the previous night's buddies. Like any bully, he had a taste for a particular type of victim. Enlisted men usually received only an occasional slap face. Officers were in for unrelenting cruelty. Among those officers, a few were especially irresistible to. Some had elevated status, such as physicians, chaplains, barrack commanders, and those who had been very successful in civilian life. Others he resented because they wouldn't crawl before him. These he singled out and hunted with inexhaustible hatred. From the moment that Watanabe locked eyes with Louis Zamperini, an officer, a famous Olympian, and a man for whom defiance was second nature, no man obsessed him more. Yeah, every characteristic that Louis has, Watanabe hates. You know, Louis is like a independent, like a strong-willed, like he'll make the best, optimistic, makes the best of every situation. You know, he's like kind of like from a poor area, but he's still an officer. He's barely an officer. You know, he didn't like graduate USC or anything, or maybe he did later, of course. But his will and his testament, you can just probably see that. I relate to this character, Louis Zamperini, really well. I think in my own life, in my own difficult circumstances I've been to, and yeah, and somebody he's found the ultimate hater that's just gonna hate his will and optimism. But if you like my reading, click the thumbs up, smash the subscribe button, and send this to somewhere on your Facebook or your Twitter, and check out my other channels as well.